The diamond sat on the empty cookie plate like a challenge to her sanity. Lorelei Everhart had moved to Thornwick exactly 17 days ago, and she'd spent most of that time regretting every life choice that had led her to a drafty apartment above a bakery in a town where the most exciting Friday night option was watching Mrs. Henderson's cats fight through the bookstore window. She'd taken the job at the bakery because it came with cheap rent, and nobody asked questions about why a 23-year-old woman would flee a perfectly good city life for the middle of nowhere. The locals had been polite enough, if distant, and the work kept her hands busy enough that she didn't have to think too much about the wreckage she'd left behind. The manor had caught her attention on her second day, visible through the trees during her morning walk. Thornwick was the sort of town that wore its Gothic heritage like a badge, all stone cottages and winding lanes. But the manor was something else entirely. 3 stories of gray stone and dark windows, wrapped in ivy and silence, set back from the main road as though it had decided long ago that the modern world wasn't worth its time. The locals called it the Ashford estate, and when she'd asked about it at the bakery, old Mr. Pemberton had given her a look that was half amusement, half warning. "Been empty near 100 years," he'd said, kneading dough with practiced efficiency. Well, empty of the living anyway. She'd laughed because that seemed like the expected response, and he'd shrugged and told her the legend. A ghost, they said. Lights in the windows sometimes. The sound of footsteps on gravel when no one was there. Things moved around inside, visible through gaps in the boards over the lower windows. The usual small-town ghost story, probably invented to give teenagers somewhere interesting to dare each other to visit. But Lorelei had been lonely, and lonely people did strange things. The first time she'd left cookies, she'd felt ridiculous. She'd baked extra chocolate chip cookies for the bakery's morning rush, and when there were 6 left over at closing, she'd wrapped them in parchment paper and walked to the manor in the late afternoon light. The gate had been chained but not locked, and the front path was overgrown but passable. She'd set the plate on the wide stone windowsill beside the front door, told herself she was being an idiot, and walked home. The next morning, she'd convinced herself she wouldn't check. She'd made it until her break at 10 before she'd thrown on her jacket and practically jogged to the manor. The plate had been empty, spotlessly clean even, as though someone had washed it. She'd stood there for a long moment, the autumn wind pulling at her hair, telling herself there were a dozen logical explanations. Raccoons, a homeless person, someone from town playing along with her weirdness. But she'd left more cookies the next day. Snickerdoodles this time. And the day after that, oatmeal raisin. Each morning the plate was empty and clean, returned to precisely the same spot on the windowsill. By the end of the first week, it had become a routine that shaped her days. She'd bake extras, pick out the best ones, walk to the manor in the evening when the light turned golden and the air smelled like wood smoke and coming winter. Sometimes she'd pause at the gate, looking up at the dark windows, wondering if anyone was looking back. On the morning of the diamond, she'd brought lemon shortbread. She'd been experimenting with her grandmother's recipe, trying to get the texture right, and these had come out perfectly, buttery and delicate, the kind that dissolved on your tongue. She'd been absurdly pleased with herself as she'd arranged them on the plate. Now the cookies were gone, and there was a diamond. Lorelei picked it up carefully, half expecting it to vanish like something from a fairy tale. It was real, though, heavy and cold and absolutely flawless, catching the morning light and throwing it back in chips of rainbow. Easily the size of her thumbnail, set in nothing, just a loose stone that had been placed with precision in the center of the plate. She looked up at the manor. The windows stared back, dark and giving away nothing. "Okay," she said aloud. "Okay. What the hell?" She pocketed the diamond because leaving it seemed rude, collected her plate, and walked back to town in a daze. At the bakery, she helped with the lunch prep and served customers and smiled until her face hurt. And all the while the diamond sat in her pocket like a burning question. That evening, she brought chocolate torte, rich and dark, the kind of dessert that required actual effort. She set it on the windowsill, and this time she didn't leave immediately. She stood on the overgrown path, arms crossed against the evening chill, and stared up at the manor. "I don't know what this is," she called out, feeling only slightly insane. "But thank you for the diamond. It's beautiful. You didn't have to do that." The manor was silent. No movement in the windows, No sound but the wind in the trees. "I'll keep bringing cookies if you want," she continued. "No payment necessary. I just thought someone should, enjoy them." Still nothing. She waited another minute, then shook her head at herself and walked home. The next morning, there were 3 diamonds. Inside the manor, Fyrion Moreau stood in the shadows of the second-floor study and watched the girl pocket the gems with an expression of pure bewilderment. He'd been dead to the world for 97 years, and apparently he'd forgotten how to interact with humans like a normal creature, if such a thing had ever been possible for him. The cookies sat on a table behind him, arranged on fine china he'd unearthed from the dining room. Chocolate torte. He'd tried a piece at midnight, alone in the vast silence of the manor, and it had been the first thing he'd tasted in decades that wasn't blood. Rich and sweet and impossibly complex, layered with flavors he'd nearly forgotten existed. He'd left 3 diamonds because one had seemed insufficient for the gift she'd given him. Not the food, though that was part of it. She'd brought light into his tomb. She'd spoken to him, her voice carrying through the broken boards and cracked windows into the dusty dark where he'd been slowly turning to stone. Fyrion had been a king once, the vampire king of the northern court, lord of 300 bloodlines, keeper of the old laws, commander of armies that had held the balance of power between the human and vampire worlds for 6 centuries. His court had been magnificent, a hidden city of marble and crystal beneath the mountains, where vampire nobility had gathered to settle disputes and forge alliances and maintain the careful equilibrium that kept their kind safe. Then there had been betrayal, ruthless and complete. His own council had turned on him, seduced by promises from Mordain, the vampire lord of the East who'd been hungry for consolidation and absolute power. The war had lasted 3 years and had nearly exposed their entire species to the human world. In the end, Fyrion's court had fallen. His people had been scattered or killed or absorbed into Mordain's expanding empire. And Fyrion himself had fled here, to this human manor that his family had maintained as a safe house for 2 centuries, and he'd locked the doors and drawn the darkness around him like armor, and waited to fade into true death. Except he hadn't faded. Vampires of his age and power didn't die easily. Instead, he'd existed in a twilight state, barely conscious, barely feeding, sustained by blood reserves he'd stored in the cellars and by the simple stubbornness that had made him a king in the first place, until she'd arrived with cookies. The first plate had confused him. He'd woken from his stupor to the smell of fresh baking, an impossibly warm scent in his cold domain. He'd thought he was hallucinating, some strange dream conjured by his starving mind. But the cookies had been real, sitting on the windowsill where afternoon sunlight would have touched them if the boards hadn't blocked most of the light. He'd taken them inside and stared at them for an hour before trying one. Chocolate chip, perfectly baked, still slightly warm. It had tasted like life. The next day there had been more, and the day after that. Each plate a small miracle, a reminder that the world was still turning outside his self-imposed exile. He'd started waking earlier, anticipating the evening ritual. He'd started moving through the manor, opening rooms he'd kept sealed, unearthing forgotten possessions. He'd started, in some small way, living again, and now he didn't know how to stop. Fyrion turned from the window and descended into the cellars, into the vault where the remnants of his treasure lay. He'd been king of a wealthy court, and even in exile he'd brought enough to sustain himself in comfort for several lifetimes. Gold and jewels, art and artifacts, currency that held value across centuries. He'd barely touched it in 97 years. Now he stood among the chests and cases, white hair falling across his face, pale hands hovering over sapphires and emeralds and rubies that glowed like frozen fire in the lamplight. "What did you give someone who'd given you back yourself?" He selected a necklace. Antique, delicate, diamonds set in platinum in a design that would have been fashionable in the late Victorian era. It had belonged to his mother. He wrapped it carefully in black silk and brought it upstairs to leave with the empty plate. Then he ate the chocolate torte, alone in the dark, and wondered if he was falling in love or simply going mad. Lorelei stared at the necklace spread across her kitchen table. The diamonds caught the lamplight and scattered it in brilliant fragments across the ceiling. She'd looked up the 3 loose stones online and had nearly had a heart attack. If they were real, and she was increasingly certain they were, she was holding somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 in her hands. Enough to pay off her student loans. Enough to start over somewhere new if Thornwick didn't work out. The necklace was worth even more, easily. It was the kind of piece that belonged in a museum or a very expensive auction house. "This is insane," she said to her empty apartment. "This is actually insane." She thought about returning it. She thought about keeping it. She thought about marching to the manor and demanding an explanation. Instead, she baked. It was what she did when her brain was too loud. She baked cinnamon rolls from scratch, the kind that took half a day because you had to let the dough rise twice and the filling needed to be perfect. She baked until her apartment smelled like sugar and yeast and comfort, until her hands were sticky and her mind was quiet. At sunset, she packed up 6 perfect cinnamon rolls, added a thermos of coffee because anyone eating sweets at this rate needed a beverage, and walked to the manor. The gate was easier to open now. She'd been oiling the hinges every few days, slowly reclaiming the path from the weeds. The manor looked less forbidding in the golden evening light, more like a sleeping giant than a tomb. She set the basket on the windowsill, then hesitated. There was a notebook in her bag. She'd brought it thinking she might write a note, but now that she was here, words seemed impossible. What did you say to a ghost who paid for cookies and heirloom jewelry? She pulled out the notebook anyway and wrote quickly before she could second-guess herself. "These are too valuable. I can't accept them. But thank you. The cookies are a gift. No payment needed. Though if you want to tell me your story sometime, I'd love to listen." She left the note weighted under the thermos, tucked the diamonds and necklace into the basket beside the rolls, and walked away before her courage could fail. Fyrion found the basket at midnight. He read the note 3 times, his ancient heart doing something complicated in his chest. She was returning the jewels. She wanted his story. No one had asked for his story in 97 years. He left the gems in the basket and took the cinnamon rolls and coffee upstairs. The rolls were still warm somehow, impossibly soft, sweet and rich with cinnamon and cream cheese frosting. The coffee was perfect, dark and strong. He sat in the study, the one room he'd allowed himself to use regularly, and he ate slowly, savoring every bite. Then he found paper and ink, the old-fashioned kind he'd always preferred, and he began to write. "I am not a ghost. I am something older and stranger. I have been alone for a very long time. Your kindness has been light in a dark place. The jewels are old things that have no value to me now. If they can be of use to you, please keep them. If not, I will understand. But I would hear your story too, if you're willing to share it." He left the letter with the gems arranged precisely on the windowsill where she would find them in the morning. Then he retreated to the shadows and waited. Lorelei found the letter at dawn. The handwriting was old-fashioned, elegant, written with a fountain pen in black ink that had a faint iridescent sheen to it. She read it standing on the overgrown path, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. Not a ghost. Something older and stranger. She should have been afraid. Every instinct should have been screaming at her to run, to tell someone, to stop this strange dance at the edge of the woods. But she'd been numb for so long, encased in the gray fog of depression and loneliness that had driven her from the city, and this was the first thing in months that had made her feel anything at all. She pocketed the letter and the gems, collected her basket, and went to work. All day she smiled and served customers and thought about her answer. At closing time, she packed up apple tart and wrote her reply. "My name is Lorelei. I moved here because I needed to be somewhere no one knew me. My fiancé left me for my best friend 6 months ago, and I stayed in the city for 3 months after that, thinking I could salvage something. But everything reminded me of him. Our apartment, our favorite restaurants, the coffee shop where we met. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. So I left. Thornwick seemed as far from that life as I could get. I've been lonely, though. Until you, whoever you are, whatever you are. This has been the best part of my days. Tell me your name?" She left it with the tart, and this time she didn't leave immediately. She sat on the steps of the manor, her back against the weathered door, and watched the sun set through the trees. The air was cold enough that she could see her breath, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the town clock striking 6. "I'm not going to run away," she said quietly. "Just so you know. You're allowed to be mysterious, but I'm not going anywhere." Inside, Fyrion stood on the other side of the door, separated from her by 3 inches of wood and a century of isolation. His hand was pressed flat against the ancient oak, and he could feel her warmth through it, could hear the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Her scent was intoxicating, human and alive, traced with vanilla and cinnamon from her baking. He wanted to open the door. He wanted to see her face, hear her voice without walls between them. But he was a vampire king, pale and inhuman, with white hair and whiter skin and eyes that glowed red when he was hungry. He was a creature of darkness and blood, and she was light itself. If he opened the door, she would run. They always ran eventually. So he stayed silent and still until she rose with a soft sigh and walked away, her footsteps fading into the evening. Then he collected the tart and the letter and retreated to his study to compose his response. "My name is Fyrion. I was a king once, though my kingdom has long since fallen. I have been hiding in this manor for nearly a century, too much of a coward to rejoin the world or brave enough to leave it entirely. I have existed in the space between, slowly forgetting what it meant to be anything but alone. You have reminded me. I am not human, Lorelei, and I do not wish to frighten you. But I find I cannot lie to you either. If you come tomorrow evening, I will leave the front door unlocked. If you wish to meet me, you may enter. If not, I will understand, and the cookies can continue. The choice is entirely yours." He left the letter at dawn, waited with an emerald the size of a robin's egg, and then he spent the day in a state of anticipation that would have embarrassed his former self. He cleaned the front rooms obsessively, dusting and polishing furniture that hadn't seen use in decades. He unearthed candelabras and lit them with real candles, chasing back the darkness. He dressed carefully in clothes that were decades out of style, but the best he had, black on black, formal in the way of old money and older power. And then he waited. Lorelei read the letter 7 times. Not human, a king of a fallen kingdom, hiding for a century. She went through the possibilities: elaborate hoax, crazy person, escaped mental patient, something genuinely supernatural. The smart thing would be to tell someone where she was going. Leave a note, at least. Call the police if she didn't come back. But she'd been playing it smart her whole life, and where had that gotten her? A broken engagement and a lonely apartment in the middle of nowhere. She baked brownies, triple chocolate with ganache frosting, the kind of dessert that was basically a marriage proposal in edible form. She showered and changed into her nicest dress, dark green wool that brought out her eyes. She pulled her auburn hair into a braid and stared at herself in the mirror. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she told her reflection. Her reflection didn't answer, but Lorelei grabbed the brownies and walked to the manor anyway. The sun was setting as she reached the gate. The front door was, as promised, unlocked. Lorelei pushed it open slowly, half expecting it to creak like something from a horror movie, but it swung silent and smooth. Inside, the manor was transformed. Candles burned in elegant holders along the hallway, casting warm light on walls that had been dusty and bare in her imagination, but were revealed now to be paneled in dark wood, hung with tapestries and paintings in the Gothic style. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and old stone and something else, something cold and clean that she couldn't identify. "Hello?" she called out, her voice smaller than she'd meant it to be. "In the study." The voice came from a room to her left, and it was like nothing she'd expected, deep and smooth, with an accent she couldn't place, cultured and calm. "Please, come in. You're safe here, I promise." Lorelei followed the voice and stepped into a room lined floor to ceiling with books. A fire burned in the massive fireplace, and more candles lit the space with a warm glow. And there, rising from a chair beside the fire, was Fyrion. She'd imagined a lot of things. She hadn't imagined him. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with a presence that filled the room despite his stillness. His skin was pale, not the pallor of illness, but something more absolute, like marble or moonlight given flesh. His hair was white, long enough to brush his shoulders, framing a face that was beautiful in the way of classical sculptures, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry. He wore black, simple and elegant, and his eyes were the color of dark wine, deep red-brown that caught the firelight. Those eyes watched her with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. "Lorelei," he said, and her name in his voice was poetry. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would." "I wasn't certain either," she admitted, stepping fully into the room. She set the brownies on a side table with hands that were almost steady. "Until the last minute. But you did." He didn't move toward her, and she appreciated that, letting her set the pace. "You're braver than I gave you credit for. Or more desperate for interesting company." She managed a smile. "Not a lot of conversationalists in Thornwick." "Then we're both desperate." His lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than the stillness he'd been holding. "I haven't spoken to anyone in 97 years. I'd forgotten how." "You're doing fine so far." Lorelei moved closer to the fire, letting the warmth chase away the evening chill. Now that she was here, she found she wasn't afraid. Nervous, yes. Overwhelmed, definitely. But not afraid. "So, not human. What does that make you?" "Vampire." He said it simply, without drama. "King of the Northern Court, before it fell. Exile now. Whatever that makes me." She should have laughed. She should have backed away. Instead, she found herself nodding slowly, pieces clicking into place. "That actually explains a lot. The century of hiding, the night visits, the whole Gothic Manor aesthetic you've got going on." "The Manor came this way," he said, and there was definite amusement in his voice now. "I can't take credit for the aesthetic. But you can take credit for the diamonds." She pulled the emerald from her pocket, held it up to catch the firelight. "Fyrion, this is too much. All of it. I brought you cookies because I wanted to, not for payment." "I know." He moved then, crossing the space between them with a grace that was definitely not human, still keeping his distance but close enough that she could see the details of him, the way his chest didn't move with breath. The absolute stillness of him when he stopped like a statue come to life. "But I have rooms full of treasures that mean nothing to me, and you brought light to my darkness. Let me give you something in return. Please." The please broke her heart a little. Her heart, this powerful creature, this vampire king, asking her permission. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, but only if you actually want to, not out of obligation." "I want to." He said it with a certainty that made heat rise in her cheeks. "I find I want a great many things now. After decades of wanting nothing, it's somewhat overwhelming." "I know the feeling." Lorelei turned to look at the books lining the walls, needing a moment to collect herself. "I stopped wanting things after Daniel left. Stopped planning, stopped dreaming. Just existed. The cookies were the first thing I'd done in months that felt like living." "Daniel is a fool." Fyrion said it with absolute conviction, "and I'm grateful to him for being one, because it brought you here." She laughed, surprised and delighted. "That's a hell of a silver lining." "I'm a creature of selfishness." But his voice was warm, and when she turned back to him, his eyes were soft. "Will you sit? Have tea with me? I've gone to considerable effort to remember how to make it." "You drink tea?" "I can. It's not sustaining, but it's pleasant. And I have an excellent collection that's been waiting nearly a century to be appreciated." So Lorelei sat in a chair that was probably an antique worth more than her car, and Fyrion poured tea from a silver service that definitely was, and they talked. About Thornwick and the city she'd left, about baking and books and the way the world had changed in a century. He was thoughtful and dry-witted, with a tendency toward self-deprecating humor that surprised her. She was quick and warm, drawing him out with questions and genuine interest. The brownies disappeared slowly as the fire burned down. Somewhere around midnight, Lorelei realized she should probably go home, but she couldn't make herself stand up. Fyrion was telling her about his court, about the vast underground city where vampires had lived in secret splendor, and his voice was painting pictures she could almost see. "What happened to it?" she asked. "You said it fell." His expression shuddered. "Betrayal. My own council turned on me, seduced by another vampire lord who wanted consolidation of power. There was a war. We lost. I fled. And you've been here ever since?" "Yes." He stared into the fire. "Waiting, I suppose. I'm not entirely sure for what." "Maybe this," Lorelei said. "Maybe you were waiting for someone to bring you cookies." He looked at her then, really looked, and the intensity of it stole her breath. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "Perhaps I was." She left an hour later, only because her eyes were starting to close despite the fascinating company. Fyrion walked her to the door, gave her a lantern for the walk home, and pressed a small velvet bag into her hands. "Don't argue," he said when she started to protest. "Just consider it payment for the brownies, which were extraordinary." At home, she opened the bag and found a pair of sapphire earrings that would have cost a fortune. She fell asleep with them on her nightstand, catching the moonlight. The visits became routine. Every evening, Lorelei would bake something special and walk to the manor. Sometimes they'd sit in the study and talk for hours. Sometimes Fyrion would show her through the manor, opening rooms that had been closed for decades, telling her stories about the treasures they contained. He had a painting by a Renaissance master whose name she recognized from art history class. He had first editions of books that belonged in museums. He had her grandmother's china in his everyday kitchen. "Fyrion," she said one evening 3 weeks in, standing in a room that appeared to be entirely full of gold coins, "you're ridiculously wealthy." "Yes," he said it simply, without pride or shame. "The court was wealthy, and I was king. I took what I could when I fled. Seemed pointless to leave it for Mordain." "Mordain is the one who betrayed you." "Yes." His voice went cold. "Though betray suggests he was ever loyal. He's been hungry for absolute power for centuries. I was simply in his way. And now he rules the Eastern Territory and most of the North, a vampire emperor in all but name. He believes I'm dead, I think, or so far gone into exile it amounts to the same thing." Lorelei turned to face him fully. "Are you planning to stay dead?" He met her eyes, and something passed between them. "I wasn't, until recently. And now? Now I don't know what I'm planning. You've complicated things considerably." "Good," she said firmly. "You've been hiding long enough. Complication is good for you." He laughed, and it was the first time she'd heard him really laugh, deep and genuine, surprised out of him. "How did you become so certain of everything?" "I'm not certain of anything, but I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting fear decide my life." She gestured at the room around them. "You have all of this, power and treasure and probably literal magic, and you've been hiding in the dark. Doesn't that make you angry?" "Fury has been my companion for a very long time." But he was looking at her with something new in his eyes, something like hope. "You think I should do something about it?" "I think you should do whatever makes you happy. And hiding alone in a manor for a century doesn't seem like happiness." It wasn't. He stepped closer, and her heart rate picked up. He definitely noticed because his eyes tracked to her throat for just a moment before returning to her face. "But I wasn't hiding from Mordain. Not really. I was hiding from failure, from the knowledge that my people died because I couldn't protect them. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? I was king. Their safety was my responsibility. Their choices were their own." Lorelei reached out without thinking and took his hand. His skin was cool but not cold, smooth and strangely perfect. "You can't control what other people do, Fyrion, even if you're a king." He looked down at their joined hands like he'd never seen anything so miraculous. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Most humans would be. I'm not most humans, and you're not most vampires." She squeezed his hand gently. "You've been nothing but kind to me, respectful and generous and interesting. Why would I be afraid? Because I'm a monster. He said it flatly. I drink blood to survive. I've killed. I'm stronger than you could imagine, and old enough that your entire lifetime is a heartbeat to me. Okay. She didn't let go. Is that supposed to scare me off? Yes. Well, it's not working. Try harder. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he pulled her closer, carefully, giving her every chance to retreat. When she didn't, he wrapped his free arm around her waist and held her against him. His voice was low and rough when he spoke. I want you. Not just your company or your cookies or your kindness. I want you in ways that would terrify you if you understood them. I want to keep you, protect you, make you mine in every way possible. Does that frighten you? Her heart was pounding so hard she was surprised it didn't bruise her ribs. No, Lorelei. I want you too, she said, tipping her head back to meet his eyes. I have for weeks. I just wasn't sure if you could want someone like me. Someone human and temporary. Temporary is negotiable. His thumb traced small circles on her lower back through the fabric of her dress. Vampires can offer eternity if that's something you'd want. That's a conversation for later. But she was smiling. Right now, I just want to know if you're going to kiss me or if we're going to keep dancing around this. So he kissed her. Carefully at first, like she might break, and then deeper when she pressed closer and wound her hands into his white hair. He tasted like the tea they'd been drinking, and his mouth was cool against hers, and it was strange and perfect and absolutely right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she was breathing hard. He was doing it for show. Fyrion rested his forehead against hers. You're certain? He asked. Completely. Then I'm keeping you. He said it with a king's authority, and she laughed and kissed him again. Things were perfect for exactly 2 more days. Then everything went to hell in the way that things inevitably do when ancient vampire politics get involved. Lorelei was at work when the strangers came to town. 3 of them, pale and beautiful and wrong in ways that made the hair stand up on the back of her neck. They came into the bakery at noon, during the lunch rush, and the conversations around them died like someone had flipped a switch. We're looking for the Ashford estate, the leader said. A woman, tall and elegant in a black suit that probably cost more than Lorelei made in 6 months. Perhaps you can direct us? Out of town, East Road. Can't miss it, Mr. Pemberton said from behind the counter. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he wiped down the counter. Been empty for years, though. Not quite empty. The woman's smile was sharp. We've heard interesting rumors. Someone's been visiting regularly, bringing gifts. Every eye in the bakery turned to Lorelei. She felt her face heat and tried to keep her expression neutral. I leave cookies sometimes, she said, raising her chin. It's just a thing I do. There's no one there. Of course not. But the woman's eyes said she knew exactly what was there. Still, we'll check for ourselves. Thank you for your help. They left, and the bakery erupted in whispers. Lorelei grabbed her phone and retreated to the back room, hands shaking as she pulled up Fyrion's number. He'd given it to her 2 days ago, programmed into her phone with a dry comment about joining the modern era. He answered on the first ring. Lorelei, there are people here, looking for you. 3 of them, vampires I think. They came into the bakery and asked about the manor, and I think they know you're there, and I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. I should have... Breathe, he said, his voice absolutely calm. Lorelei, love, breathe. Are you safe? Yes. They left. They're headed to you. Then I'll deal with them. Stay at the bakery. Don't come to the manor tonight, do you understand? Fyrion, please. And there was an edge to his voice now, something that reminded her he'd been a king. Trust me, stay safe. I'll come to you when it's done. He hung up before she could argue. Lorelei stood in the back room, staring at her phone, every instinct screaming at her to run to the manor anyway. Mr. Pemberton appeared in the doorway. You should listen to him, he said quietly. Whatever he is, those 3 are worse. I can see it in them. You know what he is. I've lived in Thornwick 70 years, girl. I know a lot of things. The manor's been protected all that time, quiet and dark. Now it's waking up, and that means trouble's coming. He gave her a long look. But if you care about him, you'll let him handle this his way. Men like that, they need to protect what's theirs. It's how they're built. So Lorelei stayed. She worked through her shift in a fog of anxiety, burned a batch of cookies, and snapped at a customer who complained about the lunch special. At closing, she stood at the bakery window and stared toward the manor, visible through the trees in the distance. "Please be okay," she whispered. At the manor, Fyrion stood in the entrance hall and watched 3 members of Mordaine's court walk through his door like they owned it. He recognized the woman in the lead, Seraphine, one of Mordaine's generals, ruthless and efficient, with a gift for tracking that made her invaluable for finding people who didn't want to be found. "Well," she said, looking around with cool appraisal, "the rumors are true. The Northern King lives. Mordaine will be so pleased." "Seraphine." Fyrion didn't move from his position at the base of the stairs. "Still doing Mordaine's dirty work, I see. Someone has to. You've been hiding for nearly a century, Your Majesty." She said the title like an insult. "We thought you were dead. Imagine our surprise when reports came of a human girl visiting the Ashford estate regularly, bringing food, receiving gifts in return. Mordaine was very interested to hear about it." "I'm sure he was." Fyrion kept his voice level, his power coiled tight inside him. He'd been weak when he fled, wounded and half-starved. He wasn't weak anymore. 97 years was a long time to heal, and Lorelei's presence had woken something in him that had been dormant far too long. "Tell me, did he send you to confirm I'm alive or to finish what he started?" "Both." Seraphine's smile was razor-sharp. "Though if you come peacefully, he's willing to offer terms. Join his court, bend the knee. He'll give you a position of honor for old time's sake." Fyrion laughed, cold and sharp. "Honor? For Mordaine? That's rich. Better than dying here alone." "I'm not alone anymore." And that was the truth that had been burning in him since Lorelei had walked away from the bakery phone call. He wasn't alone. He had something worth fighting for. "And I'm not the half-dead exile you're expecting. So here's my counteroffer. Leave. Now. Tell Mordaine I'm alive and awake, and if he wants the North, he can come and take it himself. See how that goes for him." The 2 vampires flanking Seraphine moved, faster than human eyes could follow. Fyrion was faster. He'd been king for 600 years before his fall, master of combat and politics and power. He met the first one in mid-lunge, caught him by the throat, and threw him through the study wall with enough force to shatter stone. The second got in a strike, claws raking across Fyrion's ribs, before Fyrion broke his arm and sent him crashing into the opposite wall. Seraphine watched, eyes narrowed. "Impressive. You have been healing, but you're still one against Mordaine's entire court." "Then let him bring the entire court." Fyrion's eyes were burning red now, power bleeding through his control. "I've been hiding long enough. Time to remind everyone what happens when you cross the Northern King. He'll kill you, and the human girl." The temperature in the hall dropped 10 degrees. Fyrion's voice went deadly soft. "If he touches her, I will burn his entire empire to ash and dance on the ruins. Tell him that. Make sure he understands." Seraphine held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll tell him." "But Fyrion? He won't back down. Not now. Not when he knows you're alive and vulnerable." "I know." Fyrion straightened, ignoring the blood seeping from his ribs. "Neither will I." They left, dragging their wounded with them. Fyrion stood in the wreckage of his entrance hall and felt the weight of decisions settling onto his shoulders. He'd been hiding, yes, nursing his wounds and his failures, but Lorelei had reminded him what it meant to live, and he'd be damned if he let Mordaine take that from him now. He cleaned himself up, changed clothes, and walked into Thornwick as the sun set. It had been 97 years since he'd walked openly among humans, and the town had changed. Electric lights instead of gas lamps, cars instead of carriages. But the bones of it were the same, and people still stared at him as he passed. Let them stare. He was done hiding. Lorelei lived above the bakery in a small apartment that overlooked the main street. Fyrion climbed the external stairs and knocked, and she opened the door so fast she must have been watching for him. "Thank God," she breathed, and threw herself into his arms. "I've been losing my mind. Are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm fine." He held her close, breathing in her scent, letting her warmth chase away the cold fury that had been building since Seraphine's visit. "They came. We talked. They left." That's a very sanitized version. She pulled back enough to see his face, her hands framing his jaw. "Tell me the truth." So he did. He told her about Seraphine and Mordane's offer and the fight that had destroyed part of his entrance hall. He told her about the threat to her and the promise he'd made in return. She listened without interrupting, her expression moving from fear to anger to determination. "Okay," she said when he finished. "Okay, so we fight." "We nothing." He caught her hands, held them carefully. "Lorelei, I can't ask you to be part of this. Mordane is dangerous, and his court is vast. The smart thing would be for you to leave Thornwick. Go somewhere safe." "No." "Lorelei, no." She squeezed his hands hard enough that it would have hurt if he were human. "I'm not leaving you. Not now. Not when you're finally coming back to life. If you stay, you're in danger. Then protect me. That's what you want to do anyway, right? You said it yourself. You want to keep me, make me yours, protect me. So do it." She met his eyes, fierce and certain. "But don't send me away. I won't go. You're impossibly stubborn. Yes, and you're going to have to get used to it." She pulled him inside and closed the door. "Now sit down and let me see if you're actually hurt or if you're just being stoic." He was hurt actually, though it was minor by his standards. She fussed anyway, cleaning the shallow cuts on his ribs with careful hands, and he let her because it soothed something in him to have her care. "So, what's the plan?" she asked, taping gauze over the worst of it. "I'm going to do what I should have done a century ago." Fyrion caught her wrist gently, pulled her closer. "I'm going to call in every favor I'm owed, contact every member of my old court who survived, and remind Mordane why challenging the Northern King is a terrible idea. Can you do that?" "Yes. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But I have resources, allies. I've just been too broken to use them." He kissed her palm. "You healed me, Lorelei. Gave me a reason to fight instead of just exist. Then I'm glad I left those first cookies." She was smiling, but her eyes were serious. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not terrified, but I trust you, and I'm not going anywhere." "I know." He pulled her into his lap, held her close. "Stay with me tonight, please, at the Manor. I want you where I can protect you." "Okay." She settled against him, fitting perfectly in his arms. "But I'm bringing ingredients. If we're going to war, we're doing it with proper provisions." He laughed despite everything, and she grinned and kissed him. And for a moment, the danger outside faded to nothing. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Fyrion opened his archives and started making calls on a sleek new phone he'd purchased specifically for the purpose. Messages went out through old networks, vampire channels that had existed for centuries. Word spread that the Northern King was alive and reclaiming his position. The responses came slowly at first, then faster. Old allies who'd survived Mordane's purge, noble families who'd been forced to bend the knee but had never stopped resenting it. Younger vampires who'd heard stories of the Northern Court's glory and were hungry for something beyond Mordane's authoritarian rule. Within 2 weeks, Fyrion had 20 vampires pledged to his cause. Within 3, it was 50. Lorelei watched the transformation with fascination. Fyrion was still gentle with her, still carefully thoughtful and protective. But with others, he was every inch the king he'd been, commanding and strategic, with a presence that made older vampires bow their heads in respect. He held court in the Manor's restored dining room, negotiating alliances and planning strategy with an ease that spoke of centuries of practice. She stayed out of the politics mostly, providing food and drink for the vampires who could still eat and drink, and offering the occasional human perspective when asked. But she was learning the shape of this new world, the intricate dance of vampire hierarchy and power. And she was falling more in love with every passing day. Fyrion was patient with her questions, explaining the nuances of vampire society. He introduced her to his allies as the Lady of the Manor, a title that made her blush and made his supporters hide smiles. He gave her access to his library, his treasure vault, his entire life, holding nothing back. At night, they would retreat to his chambers, and he would hold her while she slept, keeping watch like a guardian angel made of darkness and old power. "Tell me about turning," she said one night, curled against his side in the massive 4-poster bed he'd unearthed from storage. "How does it work?" "It's a choice." His hand traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "The vampire drinks from the human, then shares their blood in return. It's painful, the transformation. Takes 3 days usually, and it's permanent. Once you're vampire, you're vampire. Immortal, unless killed. Never aging, never dying of disease or time." "Do you want me to turn?" "I want you to live forever with me." He said it simply. "But it has to be your choice. I won't force it, won't even ask for it, unless you're ready." "What if I'm never ready?" "Then I'll cherish every moment I have with you and mourn for eternity when you're gone." He kissed her forehead. "But I hope you'll choose it, eventually. I've only just found you. I'm not ready to lose you in a handful of decades." She fell asleep thinking about forever, and dreamed of white hair and red eyes and diamonds on windowsills. The confrontation came on a cold night in late November. Morden himself arrived at the manor with a contingent of 20 vampires, all of them old and powerful. Fyrion met them at the gate with 50 of his own, and the night crackled with tension. Lorelei watched from an upstairs window, heart in her throat. Fyrion had forbidden her from joining him outside, and for once she hadn't argued. This was vampire business, politics and power plays that were literally older than her country. Morden was impressive, she'd give him that. Dark, where Fyrion was light, with black hair and golden eyes and a presence that felt like gravity. He smiled when he saw Fyrion, and it was the smile of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Fyrion." His voice carried easily in the cold air. "How lovely to see you alive. I'd heard rumors, of course, but I had to see for myself." "Morden." Fyrion's voice was ice and iron. "Still collecting territories and titles that don't belong to you, I see. The North belongs to me now, has for a century. You abandoned it. I left to preserve what was left of my court. You slaughtered them. There's a difference. They chose their side, as did you." Morden's eyes flicked to the manor, and Lorelei drew back instinctively from the window. "I hear you found a pet. A human. How domestic." The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Fyrion's power bled into the air, visible as frost spreading across the ground. "She's not a pet. She's mine. And if you've come here to threaten her, we can end this conversation now." So protective. But Morden's smile had edges. "I came to offer you the same terms as before. Bend the knee. Join my court. You can keep your human, keep your manor. I'll even give you a seat at my council. All I ask is your loyalty." "No." "Fyrion." "No." Fyrion's voice cracked like a whip. "I don't serve you. I never will. The North was mine long before you were born, and I'm reclaiming it. You want it? Come and take it." Morden's expression went cold. "You can't win. I have 4 territories, thousands of vampires. You have what? A few dozen loyalists and delusions of former glory? I have something you'll never have." Fyrion gestured to the vampires behind him. "I have people who follow me because they choose to, not because they fear me. I have honor and history and the rightful claim to the Northern Crown, and I have a reason to fight now. You're welcome to test me." For a long moment, the 2 kings stared at each other, power crackling between them like lightning. Then Morden laughed, cold and sharp. "Very well. If you want war, you'll have it. But know this, I will destroy you, and when I do, I'll take your human and turn her myself. She'll serve in my court for eternity, and you won't be alive to stop me." Fyrion moved. Faster than Lorelei's eyes could track, he crossed the distance between himself and Morden and had the other vampire by the throat. His voice was death itself when he spoke. Touch her, and I will end you, slowly, painfully, in ways that will make you beg for true death. Do you understand me?" Mordane's guards moved forward, but he held up a hand to stop them. "Understood. I look forward to testing your resolve." He smiled, all teeth. "See you on the battlefield, old friend." They left, and Fyrion stood in the cold for a long moment before turning and walking back to the manor. Lorelei met him at the door, and he pulled her into his arms without a word, holding her tight enough that it would have hurt if she'd been fragile. "It's war," she said quietly. "Yes. Can you win?" "I don't know." He pulled back enough to see her face. "But I'm going to try. For you. For the life we could have. Then let me help." She'd been thinking about this for days, working up the courage. "Turn me. Make me vampire. I want to fight with you." "Lorelei." "I'm serious. I'm useless like this, human and fragile. But if I'm vampire, I can help. I can fight. And I won't be a liability you have to protect while you're trying to win a war." "You're not a liability." But his eyes were haunted. "You're the only thing keeping me sane through this. Then let me do it as your equal." She took his face in her hands. "I love you. I want forever with you. And I want to fight for that forever. Not hide while you risk everything." He searched her eyes for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "After the first battle, if we survive it, I'll turn you, but not before. I won't risk you being vulnerable during the transformation while Mordane is actively hunting us. Deal." He kissed her, desperate and claiming, and she kissed him back with everything she had. The battle came 2 weeks later, on a frozen field outside Thornwick, where the old borders of the Northern Territory had once stood. Mordane brought 100 vampires. Fyrion had 75, but they were disciplined and motivated and fighting for something more than fear. Lorelei watched from a protected position on the hillside, surrounded by 3 of Fyrion's most trusted guards. She'd argued about staying behind, but Fyrion had been immovable on this. The battlefield was no place for a human, not in a fight between vampires. So she watched as the two forces met in a clash of power and violence that was both beautiful and terrible. Vampires moved faster than her eyes could track, power crackling in the air like lightning. Fyrion was in the center of it, a figure of deadly grace, his white hair flying as he cut through Mordane's forces with centuries of skill. The battle lasted hours. When it was over, Mordane's forces had retreated, leaving 30 of their number dead or dying on the frozen ground. Fyrion had lost 20, and the victory felt Pyrrhic at best, but it was a victory. Fyrion found Lorelei as the sun began to threaten the eastern horizon. He was covered in blood, exhausted but whole. She threw herself into his arms and he caught her and held on. "We won," he said. "You won." "We," he kissed her fiercely. "Come on, we need to get inside before sunrise." They retreated to the manor as the last stars faded. Fyrion's allies dispersed to safe houses and protected locations, already planning the next move. Mordane would come again, stronger and angrier. They had time to prepare, but not much. In Fyrion's chambers, Lorelei helped him clean the blood away, her hands gentle on his bruised skin. He was healing already, vampire resilience erasing the damage, but she needed to touch him to prove to herself he was alive. "I'm ready," she said as she washed blood from his hair. "For the turning, whenever you are. Now." He caught her hands, pulled her around to face him. "Before I lose my nerve, before something else happens and I can't protect you. You've been protecting me this whole time, and I always will." He drew her down onto the bed, arranged her carefully against the pillows. "This is going to hurt. I'm sorry for that. I trust you." So he bit her. His fangs sank into her throat, and the pain was sharp and bright, followed by a pulling sensation as he drank. Lorelei's vision started to gray at the edges, her heartbeat slowing. Just when she thought she might pass out, he stopped, bit his own wrist, deep enough that blood welled dark and rich, and pressed it to her lips. "Drink," he commanded, and she did. His blood was strange, thicker than she expected, with a taste like copper and wine and something indefinable. Power rushed through her with every swallow, burning in her veins, remaking her from the inside out. When he finally pulled away, she was shaking. "Sleep," Fyrion said, gathering her close. "I'll be here when you wake." The transformation took 3 days, just like he'd said. 3 days of fever and pain and strange dreams while her body died and was reborn into something new. Fyrion never left her side, holding her through the worst of it, whispering reassurances in languages she didn't understand but felt in her bones. On the 3rd evening, she woke clear-headed for the first time. The world looked different, sharper. She could hear Fyrion's heartbeat, slow and steady beside her, could smell the old wood of the manor and the lingering scent of candle wax and the distinct scent of other vampires in the rooms below. "Fyrion," she whispered, and her voice sounded different too, richer somehow. "I'm here." He was beside her instantly, helping her sit up. "How do you feel?" "Strange. Good. Different." She looked at her hands, turning them in the lamplight. Her skin was paler, though not as pale as his. Her nails were sharper. It worked. It worked. He was smiling, real and warm. "Welcome to immortality, love." She kissed him, and it was different now. She was stronger, fast enough to surprise him, and when she pulled him down onto the bed, he went willingly. They made love as equals for the first time, vampire to vampire, and it was extraordinary. Afterward, lying tangled together in the ruins of the bed, Lorelei laughed. "So this is forever." "This is forever." Fyrion traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "Are you sorry?" "Not even a little bit." The war with Mordain lasted another 6 months. It was brutal and costly, but Fyrion's forces were growing as more vampires abandoned Mordain's authoritarian rule for the chance to restore the Northern Court. Lorelei fought beside Fyrion in every battle, learning to use her new strength and speed, and she was fierce in a way that made his old allies respect her. The final confrontation came in the spring, in the ruins of the old Northern Court beneath the mountains. Mordain had fortified it as his stronghold, but Fyrion knew every passage and secret entrance from his centuries of rule. They struck at dawn, when Mordain's forces were weakest, and the battle that followed would become legend among vampires for generations. Fyrion faced Mordain in the throne room of the old court, among the rubble and dust of the kingdom they'd both claimed. It was brutal and personal, 600 years of history and betrayal crystallized into violence. In the end, Fyrion won. Not through superior strength alone, but through strategy and the desperation of a man fighting for his future rather than his past. Mordain fell, and his empire crumbled. The territories he'd claimed fragmented, and the vampires who'd served him out of fear scattered or sought amnesty from Fyrion's restored court. The Northern Court rose again, not beneath the mountains this time, but in the manor in Thornwick. Fyrion had no interest in recreating the vast hidden city of his past. Instead, he built something smaller, more intimate. A court of allies rather than subjects, a council of equals rather than a hierarchy of fear. Lorelei stood beside him through all of it, his queen in everything but name. She learned vampire politics and negotiation, using her humanity turned immortality to bridge gaps between old vampires set in their ways and younger ones hungry for change. She became known for her wisdom and her fierce protection of those under the Northern Court's protection. And every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, she still baked cookies and cakes and pastries that filled the manor with warmth and reminded everyone that immortality was meant to be lived, not just endured. 5 years after her turning, Fyrion found her in the kitchen, covered in flour and laughing at something one of their court members had said. He watched from the doorway, this ancient vampire king, and felt something in his chest that he'd thought dead for a century. Joy. "What are you smiling at?" Lorelei asked, looking up to catch his gaze. "You." He crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms, ignoring the flour that transferred to his shirt. "I'm smiling at you, at this, at the fact that you left cookies for a ghost and brought me back to life. Best decision I ever made." She kissed him, soft and sweet. "Well, second best. The first was not running away when you told me you were a vampire king. I'm very grateful for both decisions. I know. She grinned. That's why you keep giving me diamonds. Among other things. He gestured to the small box he'd set on the counter. Open it. Inside was a ring, platinum set with a diamond that caught the light and fractured it into rainbows. Simple and elegant and unmistakably an engagement ring. Fyrion, Lorelei breathed. I know we don't need human traditions, he said, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been in centuries. But I want this. I want to marry you, by human custom and vampire law both. I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours. Will you? Yes. She was crying, which was still possible even as a vampire. Yes, obviously yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, because of course it did. He'd probably had it made to her exact measurements. Then he kissed her, and the kitchen full of vampires politely pretended not to notice as their king and his queen celebrated. They were married on the summer solstice, in the gardens of the manor that Lorelei had spent years restoring. It was a small ceremony, attended only by their closest allies and a handful of humans from Thornwick who'd been brought into the secret over the years. Mr. Pemberton was there, elderly now but still sharp, and he smiled as he watched the girl who'd once worked in his bakery marry the vampire king who'd been hiding in the manor. The manor itself had been transformed. No longer dark and dusty, it gleamed with life, lights in every window, flowers in every room, laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. It was a home now, not a tomb. A place of joy rather than exile. Lorelei wore a dress of white silk that had been made by a vampire seamstress who'd survived from the old court. Fyrion wore black velvet that made him look like he'd stepped out of a Renaissance painting. They exchanged vows under the stars, promising forever to each other in front of everyone who mattered. I love you, Fyrion said, slipping a second ring onto her finger beside the engagement ring. For bringing me back to life, for seeing past the darkness to the man I could be again, for choosing forever with me. I love you, Lorelei replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. For repaying cookies with diamonds, for being brave enough to hope again, for building a future instead of hiding in the past. They kissed as husband and wife, and the crowd cheered, vampire and human voices blending together in celebration. The reception lasted until dawn, when the vampires retreated inside and the humans stumbled home to sleep. Fyrion and Lorelei stood on the balcony of their chambers and watched the sun rise over Thornwick, safe behind the special glass Fyrion had installed throughout the manor. Glass that filtered UV light, allowing vampires to experience daylight without burning. We did it, Lorelei said, leaning against him. We actually did it. We did. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on top of her head. Built a life, a court, a future. Any regrets? Not a single one. He turned her to face him, his expression soft in the dawn light. You saved me, Lorelei. In every way a person can be saved. We saved each other. She kissed him gently. And now we have forever to keep doing it. They retreated inside as the sun climbed higher, to the bed they'd shared for years now, and made love in the golden morning light that filled their chambers. Outside, the manor hummed with life. Inside, a king and his queen celebrated there forever. Years passed. The northern court prospered under Fyrion's rule and Lorelei's influence. They were fair but firm, creating a haven for vampires who wanted to live in peace rather than constant political struggle. The manor expanded, new wings added to accommodate the growing court, and Thornwick slowly transformed into a town that existed in perfect balance between human and vampire worlds. Lorelei never stopped baking. It became tradition in the northern court that every important meeting started with something she'd made, a reminder of the cookies that had started everything. She taught others, vampire and human both, and the manor's kitchens became famous among those in the know for producing pastries that could make centuries-old vampires weep with nostalgia. Fyrion never stopped giving her gifts, not diamonds anymore, or not always. Now it was books he thought she'd like. Flowers from the gardens, little surprises left on her pillow or her desk or wherever she'd find them and smile. He courted her every day of their immortal life, determined to earn the gift she'd given him over and over again. They traveled eventually, when the court was stable enough to run itself for a time. Paris and Tokyo, and cities whose names Fyrion remembered from centuries past, but which had changed beyond recognition. They saw the world together, this vampire king and his baker queen, and everywhere they went, they found joy. But they always came home to Thornwick, to the manor that had been a prison and became a palace. To the room where she'd left cookies and he'd left diamonds, and somehow they'd found each other across the gap of loneliness and loss. On the 100th anniversary of that first plate of cookies, they stood together on the front steps of the manor. The gardens were in full bloom, the windows blazed with light, and inside, their court was celebrating. Vampire and human guests mingled freely, protected by laws Fyrion and Lorelei had written together, ensuring peace between their worlds. "Do you remember?" Lorelei asked, looking at the windowsill where she'd left so many offerings. "How terrified I was. How lonely." "I remember." Fyrion held her close. "I remember thinking I'd finally found a reason to exist again, that maybe, just maybe, there was still light in the world. There was." She smiled up at him. "There is. Us, this, everything we built." "Everything we built," he agreed, "from cookies and diamonds." Inside, someone called for them to come join the celebration. There were toasts to be made, dances to be danced, 100 small moments that made up a life well lived. They went together, hand in hand, king and queen of a court built on second chances and small kindnesses. The manor stood proud against the night sky, no longer abandoned or haunted. It was full of life and love and laughter, a testament to the truth that even the darkest exile could end if someone cared enough to leave cookies for a ghost. And in the study, preserved in a frame of glass and gold, sat the first note Lorelei had ever left. The one where she'd told the ghost she'd love to hear his story. Beside it, Fyrion's response, written in elegant script on parchment that had survived a century. 2 notes that had changed everything. 2 lonely souls who'd found each other across the distance of human and vampire, mortal and immortal, darkness and light. They lived happily ever after, in the way that only immortals can. Forever stretching out before them like a promise, full of possibility and hope, and the knowledge that love, once found, need never be lost again. And somewhere in the manor's vast kitchens, a fresh batch of cookies cooled on the counter, because some traditions were worth keeping for eternity.